Wendy, darling, love of my life, I'm not gonna hurt ya. I just wanna bash your brains in. This is my audiobook review. I'm your host, Jacob Szymanski. That was a quote from The Shining by Stephen King. And if that isn't the most Stephen King line ever, I don't know what is. I know Greg David loves it. He loves everything Stephen King touches. Greg is AMI's communication specialist. How's it going, Greg?
I'm doing great. Thanks. That was a great quote, Jacob. Thank you for that.
Pretty emblematic. Now, I think it's fair to call you a Stephen King stan, or is it like on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being you hate the guy, 10 being you have posters of him on your walls? Like, where do you stand on Stephen King?
I'd say I'm a solid 9. I haven't
Yeah.
gotten so far as to put posters on my wall, but I did take time out. He got an award a few years ago in Toronto, hosted by Margaret Atwood, that I made sure that I attended and paid money to. So I'd say I'm
Huh.
a 9 because I've been reading him since I
Well,
was a kid, and I've gotten every book, anything published by him, I've read since then.
so you breathed the same air as he did in that event in Toronto. Did you meet him? Did you shake his hand?
No, I didn't
Ah,
meet him, and actually, as talking about this, it reminded me that I actually, I was, my partner now, but, when we were first started going out, we actually took a we were down in Maine and in Bar Harbor, and we took a drive by his house in Bangor, and, I got out I didn't get out of the car and get my picture taken in front of that house. I was too embarrassed to do that, and now I've been kicking myself ever since because, yeah, like, his house is just on a random residential street in Bangor. It's got this really ornate black iron gate around, like gate and fence around it. So I should have got out
yes.
of the car. So maybe I'm not a 9. If I didn't get out of the car and pose, maybe I'm an 8 because I was still too conscious of like, oh, it's kind of embarrassing. So let's say I'm an 8.
We'll settle on 8.5.
Okay, thank you.
So, do you remember the first Stephen King book that you read?
Yeah, absolutely. It was Cujo. I was taking piano lessons back when I was probably 11 or 12 at the time, and the way that my piano teacher would give all of her like kind of incentivize her students to keep practicing and to learn the songs was to give them small kind of prizes. So if I think if with something like if you made it 10 weeks with like kind of not only perfect attendance but like knowing your scales and knowing the song that she had assigned you, then she would give you a gift, like an incentive. And so I said Cujo by Stephen King, not really knowing anything about Stephen King. And she didn't understand, like at the time, that the book was, probably a little bit too adult for me to be reading it at the age of 11 or 12 because it's a rabid dog. But ever since then, I've been fascinated with the storytelling, fascinated with the characters, and yeah, I have been buying up everything that he's published since then.
You've been buying up everything that he's been publishing, like literally everything? Well, like how much have you read?
Okay, so anything that he's published, I have read or I have read online or owned. So any of his short story collections, any of his novels. He wrote a screenplay for a television miniseries back in I guess it was the early '90s called Storm of the Century. So I have that. Yeah, like I haven't gotten the point and I actually I have limited editions of a couple of his story collections as well. Yeah, but I mean, those are getting really expensive, like anything else. So, I could find. I'm not willing to. I went on a couple of rare book websites, and they're asking thousands of dollars. I'm like, okay, listen, I'm not willing to pay thousands of dollars for the book.
All right, I'm bringing you back to an 8 in that case. I'm
Yeah,
not willing
I
to
was
pay for
I
that.
was thinking that as I keep downgrading myself. I feel like I'm going to be a 1 by the end of this, Jacob. You're ruining this for me.
But no, no, no. You've read every like mainline novel
Yeah,
of his, right?
yeah.
Okay. That's a lot of books. He's been very prolific and active since the mid 70s or early 70s, I believe, and still publishing to this day. He had a new book coming out that came out in 2025.
Hmm.
He's 77 years old now. I
Yeah.
suppose writing is one of those things you can still do as an old guy.
Yeah, yeah. His first book was Carrie that came out in 1974. But yeah, he's been writing books ever since then, and in some cases, 2 books coming out a year. You're
Wow.
right about his latest book is called Never Flinch that I just finished last weekend. And yeah, he had 2 hip replacements in the last couple of years. So he was actually this latest book Never Flinch. He was having trouble writing because it turns out when you're in pain from a couple of hip surgeries, it's hard to find those creative juices and get them flowing. So it took him a lot longer to put out this book than in past books, because he's been pretty consistent with at least a book a year. It feels like, since he started publishing in 1974.
I want to explore why Stephen King got as popular as he did, but first I want to ask you like why you specifically like the guy. Like what is it about his books that keeps you coming back?
Yeah, it's interesting. I think, for me, what has always attracted me to his writing is how accessible it is. It's easy to jump into a Stephen King book. He's very good at building the world from the very beginning and introducing you to everyday characters that you can relate to. One of the things that he has said about the Harry Potter novels is that J.K. Rowling created this world that you can picture in your head, and he always appreciated that. And I think that that falls on him too. He's just so good at creating that world and drawing you into it that you become hooked for the most part. And I think as the years go by and he's figured out what his writing style is, that's what the readers are used to. He calls us constant readers. That's what, when he'll write in a prologue or an epilogue or book notes, he refers to us as constant readers. You know what you're going to get when you're going to read a Stephen King book. There's going to be some frights, there's going to be drama, and you're going to be engaged. And he just makes it very easy to get into the books. And to draw out a more long-winded answer, even longer for you, it kind of reminds me of some of the conversations that you've had on this show about beach reading and how they can be a little bit more light and easy to get into. And I feel that's the same thing with Stephen King. It's pretty easy to get into.
It's easy to get to not because they're light or like a beach read by any means. They're accessible because they're well written.
Yeah.
One of the characteristics of his books that I've found is that he avoids giving too much information. And he specifically talks about this. He's talked about this in his book On Writing, which is a memoir that came out in the early 2000s, and in interviews where he says that the world like descriptions starts with the author but finishes with the reader, and so he's not overly descriptive. And so you yourself are left to fill in the gaps, but we do that very naturally. It is easy for us to fill in the gaps. It's hard to read a book that has extensive description where you kind of need to come to grips with the author. Like he gives us a lot to work with, and even if we fill in the gaps, it still makes sense. So it's accessible in that sense. But more than anything, he really lives more in like internal dialogue, basically all the
Mhm.
good stuff. And I find that's what makes it so approachable because they're not complex novels, but they're meaty, if that makes sense.
I think that's a perfect
Mhm,
description. Yeah, I think that you've
mhm,
you've described that perfectly, and
mhm.
and probably why he's so much of his success, right?
Yeah, exactly. His books are like a cordon bleu with like a deep fried cordon bleu with a fancy salad with 20 different types of salads. It's not insanely fancy.
Yeah.
But like his books are more like a good steak. They're
Oh,
meaty
that's
and
good.
enjoyable.
Nice. I was gonna say maybe TV dinner, but I like that better. I like steak. Yeah, yeah, that's good.
Because steak really is simple. You don't need a lot of seasoning, but it's still
You're right.
hearty and a lot to chew on. Whereas like a beet treat is just like butter noodles. I love butter noodles though. So okay, what's your favorite? What's your favorite Stephen King era? Because he has had different like phases in his career.
Oh
Like,
my
what's most
gosh.
like? Okay, this is a tough question. I can tell.
No, that's a great question. I think that's fantastic. I think that Cujo opened the door for me to his earlier works because, like we talked about earlier, his first book, Carrie, came out in 1974. And so I think early 70 or late 70s, early 80s, Stephen King is my jam because in 1975, Salem's Lot came out, and that book is about a small town and vampires. 1977, The Shining came out, which you mentioned the quote off the top. It's about a haunted hotel.
Hmm.
1978 was The Stand, which was a huge book about the post-apocalyptic US with good battling evil. I love that book. The Dead Zone came out in 1979 about a guy who could read people's minds and see the future. And then when you jump to Cujo in 1981, which is about a rabid dog, and then you get into 1983. So 1983, I'm in grade 8, grade 9. Christine, A Haunted Car. Pet Cemetery, a cemetery where animals and people come back to life. Those are the years where, in talking about them, the hair goes back on the back of my neck, because those were the years and those were the books that really I loved and coveted and still go back to. There are lots of other books throughout there, like Shawshank Redemption, which is a novella, It, which is a fantastic book and maybe my favorite book of all time. But
Hmm.
the genre, the years, late 70s into those early 80s are my favorites for his books.
Okay, so generally, like his early stuff, his classic era, if you want to put it that way. Can we touch on it though?
Yeah,
Um, your favorite book of all time. We have to expand on that. Why?
sure. So
Hmm.
the reason that I love it so much is I finally had enough money to buy it for myself. It was my first hardcover book, and I ordered it, and
It's
I
a
went
big
into the
book too.
bookstore, and it is a big book. It is a big book. At the time, they called it his magnum opus. And what I love about it is it's about the town of Derry. There are the movies that you can watch, and there was a miniseries that came out in the late '80s, early '90s that you can watch too. But I don't think anything beats the book. And so the book is the story of the small town of Derry and the kids that lived in it in the late 50s and then come back to that town as adults for a reunion. And it melds the haunting of what's happening in this town throughout the history of the town and this thing, this it that is under the town and is killing kids. And when the surviving kids come back as adults for a reunion, they decide that they're going to take it down.
Hmm.
So it melds the classic horror story of like a haunted house or a haunted town, the monster, because it can takes on the shape of whatever it is you're most afraid of. So it could be a mummy, it could be a huge bird, it could be a vampire, it could be a killer clown. It melds the histories of the town into one big book and all of those classic monsters. And it also is a book that's largely about childhood and growing up and gaining friends and the power of friends. So there's just so much stuff that's all in that really big book that I've loved ever since the first time that I read it. And I've got three versions of it. I've got the initial hardcover that I bought, I've got a paperback version, and then I've got one from a society that did like a special version of it. So that's my favorite book of his.
It's true that it has a lot to do with childhood, and that's one of the weird things with Stephen King is he writes a lot of very macabre subjects,
Hmm.
and a lot of horror, body horror, all sorts of horror. Um, but the way he talks about more heartfelt subjects like childhood and growing up and even love and romance, he does it very tastefully. He's a bit of a cheeseball when he needs to be. Like he's not just like some gory, like edgy horror author. And that characterization is something he's actually kind of pushed back on a little bit in interviews where he's like, doesn't write strictly horror. It's more than that, isn't it?
Yeah, it really is,
Yeah.
and it's
Yeah.
something that I've seen over the
Mm.
years as his evolution as a writer and a storyteller. There's romance in his books. One of the other ones that stands out to me is called Insomnia, and it deals with getting old and aging, and there is a twist on it because it's about elderly people who are not able to sleep at night, and when they're up in the dead of the night, they see things that are starting to happen on their street that are kind of otherworldly. But at its heart, it's a book about getting old and facing, getting being that way in your life. Misery to a certain extent, although I don't know whether you could traditionally say that it's a horror story. He's writing about the successes or the bad things that happen when you're a successful novelist. A very personal story. So yeah, I mean, it's kind of like all these things that he writes about: children growing up, love, all within that kind of supernatural umbrella, underneath that supernatural umbrella.
Yeah, in The Shining, the relationship between the main character and his wife is
Hmm.
like it's complicated, but it's also very wholesome and like fully explored in that book. And it's something I wasn't expecting because I think that was like the second Stephen King book that I read. Um, one of the unique characteristics of his characters is that they're often pretty ordinary
Yeah.
in the sense they don't have like incredible skills or are like unbelievably competent at certain things. Like they're just regular people finding themselves in extraordinary situations, which means they make mistakes. They're very flawed, but they're also kind of likable in that they just do crazy things in the way that they react to the absurd things that Steven throws at them.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, The Shining is about a janitor, a hotel janitor,
Yeah,
and the
just
dissolution.
some guy.
Yeah, just some guy in the dissolution of, the family, and, even though it's supernatural in tone, it's also you're seeing in a very extreme supernatural way how a marriage can break down. I mean, you can't get any more literal than what happens in that book. But
Yeah.
yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right, and I think that Christine is about a high school kid buying his first car, and that first car just happens to be possessed by one of its previous owner. So yeah, it's just these relatable characters, that just these aw shucks people that somehow they end up with these terrible, awful things happening to them. And I guess that gets back to the accessibility that we've talked about off the top, right? If his story is about like the King of England and something happening to him, well, maybe you can't really relate to that, or the boss of a Fortune 500 company, but you can if it's the janitor that's going schlepping to this hotel for a winter of work, and something bad happening to him.
What does that say about us that we wouldn't be able to connect to the King of England or or a Fortune 500 company getting into some trouble? It's true. If if you wrote a book about that type of thing, I feel like it wouldn't resonate that well, right? And that kind of plays into something that people say a lot about Stephen King is that he writes for the everyman,
Yeah.
and a huge part of that is that his characters are everymen, so to speak.
Yeah, and I feel like that sometimes, Jacob, is kind of when people say that, it's a negative. Like I feel like, when people say, "Oh, he's writing for the everyman," that's a dig, and I don't find that.
I never took it as a dig. How
Yeah.
is it a
Oh,
dig?
uh, because I think that he's alluded, and I feel like some people have alluded that writing for the everyman means that you're not writing for awards. Like you're not writing
Oh,
of mice and men. You're not writing great expectations. And I don't think that that's the point when he's writing those books. So I think when people say writing for the everyman, I think sometimes that's been taken as a negative, that he's not shooting for something loftier.
Oh, okay, yeah, I see what you mean. Is that he's not writing the literary stuff that gets the
Yep,
recognition from the highfalutin highbrow critics, right?
exactly. Yeah.
What other books of his are in your top 5?
I would say that the Bachman books are probably in my top 5, and for those that don't know, there was a time where early in Stephen King's career, he just had written so many books that he started to write under a pseudonym, and he also wrote under a pseudonym because the books were a little bit different in tone from some of the horror books that he had written. So there's actually they're called the Bachman books. They were sold back in the late 70s and early 80s as separate books, but they all got put together into a compendium. And there's some of my favorites as well. There's one that's called The Long Walk, which is about a bunch of kids who are made to walk at a certain speed along the highways of the eastern US. And if they keep up that speed, and they're the last one standing, they win a huge cash prize for their family.
That sounds
But if
awesome. Well, I never heard of it.
Thing
But
is, if you walk under a certain speed, you get 3 warnings, and after that 3rd warning, they pull you off to the side of the road and shoot you in the head. So
Jesus.
yeah. So that's actually coming out as a movie, later on this year, with Mark Hamill playing one of the lead characters. So that's a great book under the Bachman books. The Running Man is also another one that was written under the Richard Bachman name, and it's about a guy who, again, is trying to it's kind of, it's written as the future, and where this game show called The Running Man, you are in a competition where you're hunted by bounty hunters. If you make it past the bounty hunters to a goal, you win a whole bunch of money. But of course, if you lose, the bounty hunters take you out. So yeah, those are two of my favorite books of the Bachman books, and again, all put together into like a one compendium.
His movies tend to translate very well to movies, right? Like, obviously, part of that is just the name brand recognition. A book that sells well is very tempting for a movie studio to produce
Sure.
into a movie, right? But
Yeah.
there's something about the quality of his books that just work well in movies. And I think part of that is just they often have just really wild premises.
Yeah, it's true, and I would say that some of them, have mixed results when it comes to the screen. It's really hard to
Hmm.
sometimes take a book and translate it to the screen. The Green Mile with Tom Hanks, which is about a prison, is was translated wonderfully to the big screen. The Shawshank Redemption is always going to be one of my
Both
favorite translations.
classics.
Yeah,
Mm.
Misery is great, made into a movie from the original source material.
Yeah.
But the Dark Tower was made into a movie, and I really didn't like it. It's tough to take a movie that take 5 books and translate them down into one movie. I think that's a pretty tough call. But yeah, for the most part, they've been pretty good. But I just mentioned a few of my favorite films adapted from his books.
I want to throw in one more book I want to highlight, and this is a book you brought to our attention. You told our colleague Rami Amathan about it, and then she told me about it. On Writing, the one that
Yeah,
came out in 2001, I
yeah.
believe. It was a memoir slash instructional guide on how to write fiction.
Yeah, and it's always been my favorite. I go back to it every once in a while and kind of remember, I think I've kind of left my writing behind, writing fiction. I had done that in high school, but I still go back to it and look at those tips and still apply them to the press releases and the press kits and the things that I write today. But little things like read every day, like you talk about standing in line at the bank. Well, standing in line at the bank, we don't do that anymore. But when we did stand in line at the bank, he would, have a book with him and read. Now we're looking at our phones, but I really think that, when you have a free moment, put your phone down, listen to an audiobook or pick up a book and read a paper book because, you can get, be taken into those fantasy worlds that the writers like Stephen King have made for us.
I can't even imagine waiting in line and reading a book. That just seems so suspicious.
Ah, Jacob, back in the day, we used to do that. We used to talk to people too. We would look up from our there was no such thing as a cell phone, and we would have to converse with people. It was a different time.
Yeah, and then you would see the cover, like the person,
Yeah,
like of the book the person is reading, and be like,
yeah,
"Wow, you're reading that."
yeah.
But one of the things that I realized about Stephen King as a person in that book on writing is that he genuinely and full-heartedly loves books and storytelling in an
Mhm.
unpretentious way, and just like to tell a story for the sake of telling a story. He's not full of himself. He's actually very humble. It's like
Yeah,
he's confident but humble. He's such a likable dude as a person. And the way he comes off in that book is just like this dude casually telling you all his writing advice, and it's extremely practical. And he does it very comically. Like he says, the road to hell is paved in adverbs, and then goes into all sorts of examples why adverbs add absolutely nothing. Like if you say somebody ran quickly, yeah,
yeah.
running naturally is quickly. You don't need to add quickly there. And to use more impactful words that evoke more emotion. Like instead of saying he was scared, you could say the sweat was running down his cheeks, as in to say like down his brow. See, to again let the reader like finish the description themselves in their head, right? To involve the reader in it. He has such good advice.
Yeah, it's true. He's giving you a blueprint, in those couple hundred pages. He's giving you a blueprint on how to write. But, how many of us can actually sit down and do that writing? And I think that that's the sneaky cool thing about him as well, is he's been so prolific over these decades of work. And here's a book where I can tell you how to write, not necessarily write, but like me, but to write and here are the good habits. And yet, he makes it look so easy, and yet it's so difficult to sit down and write. And that's what makes his work so impressive to me.
And he puts a lot of emphasis on continuing to read yourself, right? You
Hmm.
can't be a chef if you don't go to fancy restaurants regularly. You can't be a filmmaker if you don't watch movies. It only makes sense. You need to read to keep up your curiosity, to see what actually interests you, to be a reader, and that applies to any craft. It's so important. But he has a very eclectic taste in the books that he enjoys, and it's interesting the books that he criticizes and the books that he praises. Like for example, you mentioned that he loves Stephen King. He loves Harry Potter. I
Yeah.
mean, and J.K. Rowling's work.
Hmm.
He really dislikes the Wheel of Time. Strangely enough, probably because it's huge and insanely descriptive. But most notably, he loved the Molly the Maid series by Nina Prose, who's a Canadian
Mm.
author,
Mhm.
which is like a cozy mystery series with like a quirky character. I would have never thought that Stephen King would love that book, but he loved it just as much as we did. And we actually reviewed that one a little earlier this week. So a little earlier this year. So pretty eclectic taste in books too. Just seems like a very open-minded dude.
Oh, for sure. And I mean, that's the way that you get your inspiration, right? Like you don't have to be reading horror books all the time to be inspired to write horror. You know, you it's like listening to music. I'm the same way with my books. I read Stephen King, but I read a lot of other stuff. I've come on the show to talk about my love of history and nautical things and that type of thing. And it's the same thing with music. Yeah, I grew up in the hair metal genre, but I listen to everything because you should listen to everything. It's how do you find out about other things if you're not checking those other things out and being curious?
If you're writing, you don't want to be so locked into your genre, right? Like if you're writing strictly horror, but you completely negate any kind of like suspense
Hmm.
because like I don't know, you don't read suspense novels, like you're only doing yourself a disservice. You
Yep.
don't think that your horror story could use like some romance subplot? Absolutely not. Like that's why it's so important to have that variety of inspirations to bring all sorts of different things together. The genre that you choose is just what's at the forefront, but there should
Yep.
be a lot in the background. Otherwise, you end up with a book that's just butter noodles.
Well said. Oh, I love it. You brought it full circle, Jacob. You are a professional.
Before we let you go here, uh, is there one more Stephen King book that has like a special place in your heart? One more highlight?
Yeah, I would say that it is a book that Eyes of the Dragon, which is more of a fantasy book that he
Oh,
wrote, and I read it back when I was in high school. And it's a fantasy about a child. It's written like with kings and queens and princes. It's a little bit of a take on the Merlin Arthurian legend. It's a great one and very very different from anything that he'd written before that or since. It almost reads a little bit like a children's book. There are huge spiders and lightning and thunder and curses in it, so uh, it's not
hmm.
quite for all for all kids, but older kids. But that's one that I really like, and that's outside of the horror genre for sure.
Yeah, Eyes of the Dragon by Stephen King. I've heard that that one is a really underrated book. And again, outside the horror genre, so you wouldn't really expect it from Stephen King. I'm super interested in that one. Greg, thank you so much for your time. I'm upgrading you back to a 9 out of 10, okay?
All right, thanks, Jacob, and thanks so much for having me on. I
Yeah,
appreciate
of
it.
course. Have a good one. That was Greg David. He's AMI's communications specialist. He was here talking about his favorite author, Stephen King. That's all the time we have for today's edition of AMI Audiobook Review. AMI Audiobook Review airs at uh, 1 p.m. Eastern on weekends and repeats every 6 hours. But we also make ourselves easy to find. We're on all the big podcasting platforms, and that includes YouTube. You can send us your feedback at audiobookraview@ami.ca. And you can also follow us on our Instagram at AMI Audiobook Review. Our handle is at AMI Audiobook Review. I'm Jacob Shamansky. Happy listening.